I appreciate your song leading so much. You mentioned we had the men's leadership class last Sunday, and Hank mentioned times when we might as men have to stand up and do things that maybe we're not accustomed or used to doing, which would include leading singing, and situations such as when there's only women who make up the congregation, and that might seem far-fetched, but I will never forget preaching at a congregation in Arkansas where it was a congregation of only women. And we would travel from the Memphis School of Preaching and go out to Arkansas, and would be my wife, I believe Bailey at the time, and myself, and these ladies, and I was having to lead singing as well. And it certainly is not an easy task, and so grateful for all of our song leaders and for the songs that we're able to sing. This evening we're going to do a little bit of a word study. But probably more so make application and find various verses throughout the Scripture regarding this word. Go with me to 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2. And we're going to see here a word that we can study and think about and then apply and hopefully aid us throughout the week and in our efforts to serve the Lord and be faithful unto Him. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15, Paul writes to Timothy there, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." That word approved comes from the Greek word dokimos or dokimos, which carries with it an idea of authenticity, an idea of being genuine and of high integrity. During the first century, there was a money system that required authenticity, integrity. I'm going to read a quote here from Donald Gray Barnhouse in his book Romans, God's Glory on page 18. He writes, "In the ancient world there was no banking system as we know it today, and no paper money. All money was made from metal, heated until liquid, poured into molds, and allowed to cool. When the coins were cooled, it was necessary to smooth off the uneven edges. The coins were comparatively soft, and of course many people shaved them closely. In one century, more than 80 laws were passed in Athens to stop the practice of whittling down the coins then in circulation. But some money changers were men of integrity, who would accept no counterfeit money. They were men of honor who put only genuine, full-weight money into circulation. Such men were called dokimos. And this word is used here for the Christian as he is to be seen by the world, but ultimately seen by God. You notice there in verse 15, study to show thyself approved unto God. The focus is to be acceptable and to be genuine in the sight of our Lord. There are several areas and verses where this word is used. For example, it's not always translated into approved. James chapter 1 and verse 12, James writes there, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried," that's the word dokimos there, "he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him." So to be approved in the sight of God, or to be tried, to be tested, to be proven genuine, to be proven authentic, is one that will receive the crown of life, receive the promise that the Lord has to offer. And so let us think about this word being approved, and let us think about ways in which we might become off-centered in how we should be seeking approval in the sight of God, and also ways that we can be strengthened in our efforts to be approved in His sight. Number one, in seeking the approval of God, we could become misguided. We could become misguided. In other words, we could begin to think of ourselves, although in understanding and in the Lord's house, we could become misguided and ultimately looking and seeking His approval. Look with me in John chapter 12. John chapter 12. Here Jesus is in the midst of His work as He is furthering the gospel, furthering the message of His work and His ministry and the salvation that He is bringing. But we see that there are some who are unwilling to embrace this. Verse 42 in John chapter 12, "Nevertheless, among the chief rulers also, many believed on Him." So they had a recognition of what it was that He was teaching. They had a recognition of the salvation that the Messiah, the Christ, was going to bring. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. They had become misguided in their efforts to be approved in God's sight. They were still amongst God's people. They were still in the household of God during that time, that is, the nation of Israel. But they were misguided. They were no longer aiming to be accepted in the sight of God, but rather sought the praises and acceptance of men. Folks, if we're not careful, we can very easily be swindled into this type of thinking, and we're warned of it throughout the Scriptures. Look with me in the book of Psalms, Psalm chapter 60, there in verse 11. Give us help from trouble, for vain is the help of man. Trading the approval that we could have in the sight of God by doing His will for the approval that we could gain via the praises of men is not going to grant us the help, is not going to grant us the security that we need for our eternal souls. That help that man has to offer is ultimately vain. Look with me as well in Psalm 118. Psalm 118, verses 8 and 9. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in princes. Yes, even those of high authority are not going to have what it takes in order for us to find trusting salvation, trusting help and security regarding our souls. Likewise, look with me in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 12. Proverbs 14 and verse 12. There is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Folks, if we allow ourselves to be fooled by seeking to gain the approval and the acceptance and the praises of men that is separated from the law of God, then we are going to allow ourselves to enter down a path which its end is death. God repeats this for us in Proverbs chapter 16 and in verse 25. There is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Indeed, our Father is reminding us and commanding us not to become confused or misguided in our efforts to be approved in His sight, but rather to remain focused on His law and on what His Word requires so that we can have heaven as our home. There's another example of one who became misguided in what he understood to be acceptable, and that is found in Numbers chapter 22. In Numbers chapter 22, we see there in verse 2 that Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. God's people are moving down the field, if you will. They're being successful in their battles, trusting in the Lord. And Balak here sees this and is concerned. And so Moab was sore afraid of the people because they were many. And Moab was distressed because of the children of Israel. And so we see then what Balak does. Verse 5, he sends messengers, therefore, unto Balaam, the son of Beor, to Pethor, which is by the river of the land of the children of his people, to call him, saying, Behold, there is a people come out from Egypt. Behold, they cover the face of the earth, and they abide over against me. Come now, therefore, I pray thee, curse me, this people, for they are too mighty for me. Peradventure I shall prevail, that we may smite them, and that I may drive them out of the land. For I wot that he whom thou blessed is blessed, and he whom thou cursest is cursed. And the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the rewards of divination in their hand, and they came unto Balaam, and spake unto him the words of Balak. And he said unto them, Lodge here this night, and I will bring you word again, as the Lord shall speak unto me. And the princes of Moab abode with Balaam. So certainly Balaam is in God's graces. He's able to communicate with God. He's able to interact with God. And so he's going to go and ask God regarding whether or not the children of Israel could be cursed. And God says to Balaam, What men are these with thee? Verse 9. And Balaam said unto God, Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, hath sent unto me, saying, Behold, there is a people come out of Egypt,
which covereth the face of the earth. Come now, curse me them. Peradventure I shall be able to overcome them and drive them out. And God said unto Balaam, Thou shalt not go with them. Thou shalt not curse the people, for they are blessed. God gave Balaam the answer. If Balaam is seeking the approval of God, the answer is very clear. And so initially, Balaam responds. He goes in the morning and says to the princes of Balak, Get you into your land, for the Lord refuseth to give me leave to go with you. And the princes of Moab rose up, and they went unto Balak and said, Balaam refuseth to come with us. And Balak sent yet again princes more and more honorable than they. And they came to Balaam and said to him, Thus saith Balak the king of Zippor, Let nothing, I pray thee, hinder thee from coming unto me. For I will promote thee unto very great honor, and will do whatsoever thou sayest unto me. Come therefore, I pray thee, curse me this people. And Balaam answered and said unto the servants of Balak, If Balak would give me his house full of silver and gold, I cannot go beyond the word of the Lord my God to do less or more. Now, I've heard of a preacher. He was about 9 years old. Just, I think, been baptized around the age of 7 or so, and about the age of 9, was preaching one of his first sermons. And he was preaching on Balaam and Balak here, and he got done down to verse 18 and stopped there and said, We should do as Balaam does. And we should be willing to stand before those that are asking us to go against the Lord's will and say, I cannot do less or more than what the Lord requires. Well, that would have been a good sermon if that was the end of the story here, but unfortunately it's not the end of the story. Balaam became misguided in seeking the Lord's approval and all of a sudden became allured by the great honor and riches and approval that men was willing to grant him. And so therefore we see in verse 19, although he answers and says, look, there's no way I'm going to be able to change the answer, I'll go check with the Lord once again. And so we see then the outcome of this, and Peter reminds us of it in 2 Peter chapter 2, and in verse 14 beginning, regarding those who were full of adultery in their eyes, and they don't cease from sinning. They're beguiling unstable souls. They're exercising covetousness and cursing children. They have forsaken the right way. Verse 15, they've gone astray. What are they doing? They're following the way of Balaam, the son of Besor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness, but was rebuked for his iniquity. The dumb donkey, speaking with man's voice, forbade the madness of the prophet. And so although he still sought these riches, he still sought the approval that Balak was willing to offer him, God allowed him to go on and eventually had to rebuke him by a donkey speaking unto him and telling him to go no further. But the outcome still brought about destruction to Israel, because Balaam figured out another way as to how God's people could be cursed. You know what? Balak, maybe something along these lines is what was discussed. I can't curse this people. These people serve the one true and only living God. But I tell you what, if you want them to be cursed, figure out a way to have them commit idolatry and put them at enmity with God. And then God will bring about their destruction. God will bring about their heartache. John writes of this in Revelation chapter 2, and in verse 14 he says, But I have a few things against thee, because thou hast there them that hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel. How? To eat things sacrificed unto idols and to commit fornication. And so therefore, Balaam still figured out a way to gain the approval of Balak, to gain the approval of men, and became misguided rather than focusing in on seeking and pursuing God's approval. Our efforts to seek approval could become misguided, but it also could be or could become misaligned. Go with me to Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18, you see here one that is misaligned. In other words, he's seeking God's approval. He is indeed recognizing that God is the one that I'm wanting to please, but he's misaligned in that he's not doing it according to God's word. This is Apollos. We see in Acts chapter 18, beginning of verse 24, and a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. And he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom, when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them, and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. A husband and wife team working together to go and rebuke Apollos in the way in which he is teaching, doing it privately, going about it in a private, secretive manner so that he could be corrected. How did he respond when he recognized he was misaligned in the approval that he was seeking from God? Well, we see in verse 27, he was disposed to pass into Achaia. The brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him, who, when he was come, helped them much which had believed through grace, for he mightily convinced the Jews, and that publicly, showing by the scriptures that Jesus was Christ. In other words, he recognized that the gospel included the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and that baptism was supposed to be according to the authority of Christ and according to that death, burial, and resurrection. And so Apollos at one time was misaligned, but upon being corrected was willing to come to the truth. If we're misaligned in our efforts to be approved in the sight of God, how willing are we to be corrected? We might respond and say, wait a second, I'm sincerely striving to serve the Lord. I am passionately focused on pleasing Him. And you're telling me that I'm wrong? Don't you know my heart? Don't you know my mind? I don't want to do anything contrary to the will of God. How dare you tell me I'm in error? Folks, that's not how Apollos responded. Apollos recognized the correction, recognized who he was ultimately seeking to be approved in the sight of, God, realized he was misaligned in it, fixed it, and kept going. Are we willing to be wise and be corrected if we're in the wrong and misaligned? Or are we going to be fools and unwilling to embrace correction? The Proverbs writer writes of this a great deal. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Are we willing to be taught? Are we willing to be corrected and instructed? Well, if we're willing to be wise, then we will do so. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 8, the wise in heart will receive commandments, but a prating fool shall fall. Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 1, whoso loveth instruction loveth knowledge, but he that hateth reproof is brutish. Now, folks, I understand we don't wake up in the morning and say, I can't wait to be wrong and be corrected. I understand that. I understand it's difficult for us to receive correction, whether it be in our own personal study, whether it be because of the preacher, whether it be because of the elders, whether it be because of our spouse or those within our household. I understand being corrected is not an exciting thing. But if that correction enables us to align ourselves with the heavenly commandments granted by the graciousness of God, and our attitude is such that we want to be right in God's sight, then folks, it ought to be something we should rejoice over. It ought to be something that we're thankful for. Spiritually speaking, we are incapable, in the context of this lesson, this very discussion, of ever being able to graduate and leave from riding our spiritual bikes without training wheels. Folks, we will always need them. And God's Word provides that to us. Again, whether it's that we're ingesting it ourselves, whether it's being taught or preached or used by another, God's Word gives us those training wheels. Now, when you're first riding a bike, do you want those training wheels? Oh, yes, you do. You're terrified. Navy sits in the driveway. He doesn't even pedal the bike. He literally just sits there and watches his brother and sister go around. It's terrifying when you first get on a bike to imagine a bike without training wheels. And then the fact that you're able to have those training wheels, it's something that you're very grateful for. Well, folks, we should be that way when it comes to spiritual correction. Man, am I thankful that God has given me His Word. I am so thankful for my brethren. I am so thankful that I can be metaphorically yanked by the collar a time or two to be reminded of how I need to behave and press on toward heaven above. Folks, our world is contrary to this mindset. How dare you ever correct me? How dare you ever tell me that I need to change something? Folks, the Christian, no matter how old, no matter how studied, no matter how faithful, if he or she is faithful, will always appreciate and be grateful for correction. Always. Apollos was misaligned, but he's corrected. But Apollos wasn't the only one. Who else was misaligned? Saul. Saul was misaligned. Now, folks, was he doing what he was doing, thinking that it was violating God's will? No, he was doing what he was doing. He was as aggressive as he was because he thought it was God's will. He was trying to stop the spread of the gospel because he was convinced that it was contrary to the law of God. And he thought by doing so, he was sincerely seeking the approval and gaining it from the Father. He explains in Acts chapter 23 and verse 1, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. Till the day when he realized he was misaligned. But in being misaligned, Paul was likewise willing to humble himself, to submit himself unto the gospel, and to begin down the right path. As a matter of fact, upon being baptized, we learn in verse 20 of Acts chapter 9, straightway, in other words, immediately, he preached Christ in the synagogue that he is the Son of God. Folks, that's the most beautiful thing about correction. That's the most beautiful thing if we're misaligned. Is the hardest part is just the humility in recognizing that we're misaligned, getting on the right track, and then still going full speed. But going full speed now aligned with God. And that's what Paul did. He explains to the Galatian brethren in Galatians chapter 1, beginning there in verse 11, But I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. For ye have heard of my conversation in time past in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted it, and profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals in mine own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. But when it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood. In other words, I didn't need the approval of men. I didn't need to go around and check in with the apostles in Jerusalem and make sure and get on their same page. I received it from God, and I knew I was wrong, and I got in line. Folks, he gave up a great deal to get in line. He explains that a little bit in Philippians chapter 3, verses 4 and 6. The great deal of prestige that he had in the Jewish religion. He was misaligned. Sometimes we can seek approval, but we might be misguided. Sometimes we might be misaligned. However, we also might be mistaken by the world. In other words, us in seeking approval correctly and striving after the Lord's commandments, the Lord may mistake that for something else. And folks, we don't need to be giving any weight to the world's judgment regarding our Christianity.
The world has their own definition of what it means to be a Christian. And generally, that definition is the farthest from the Bible when they recognize that being a Christian means that they have to change their life. Folks, we're going to be called things. I know we live in the world and age of Facebook, although that may be declining here soon, who knows. And we like this idea of being, quote, liked. And that gives us a great deal of purpose to this generation. Being a Christian means there's going to be times when we're just not going to be liked. And in seeking the approval of God, we might be mistaken for doing something else according to the world. Look at, for example, Jesus. John chapter 10 and verse 20. We see there that many of them say regarding Jesus, He hath a devil and is mad. Why hear ye him? Statement could be no farther from the truth. But what are they inferring here? That Jesus has a devil, and why in the world would you be listening to him? Look likewise in Mark chapter 3 and verse 22 here. Mark chapter 3 and verse 22, and the scribes which came down from Jerusalem said, He hath Beelzebub, and by the prince of the devils casteth he out devils. Look at how the world is mistaking Jesus seeking the approval of the Father. What about Paul? Was Paul mistaken? Absolutely. Galatians chapter 4 and verse 16, Paul says, Why have I become your enemy? I've become your enemy for telling you the truth. Likewise, look at Acts chapter 17 and in verse 32. Acts chapter 17 and in verse 32, after Paul preaches regarding the gospel and the resurrection of the dead, some mocked him. Some mock Paul for this. Look what Jesus tells us regarding the fact that the world mistakes us in our efforts to seek God's approval. John chapter 15 and verse 18, beginning there. If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love his own. But because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. Remember the word that I said unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they have kept my saying, they will keep yours also. But all these things they will do unto you for my name's sake, because they know not him that sent me. Look as well in Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10, beginning there in verse 22. Verse 22, And ye shall be hated of all men for my sake, my name's sake. But he that endureth to the end shall be saved. But when they persecute you in this city, flee ye also into another. For verily I say unto you, ye shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come. The disciple is not above his master, nor the servant above his Lord. It is enough for the disciple that he be as his master, and the servant as his Lord. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more shall they call them of his household? Fear them not, therefore, for there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, and hid that shall not be known. What I tell you in darkness, that speak ye in the light, and what ye hear in the ear, that preach ye upon the housetops. And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Folks, Jesus is reminding us there, don't become misguided. Don't become misaligned because of the pressure that the world applies in mistaking you, in inappropriately labeling you, in longing after the approval of your Father in heaven. Friend, brother or sister, are you approved in the sight of God this evening? Let us all look and strive for that day when we can have the Lord saying to us, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. Matthew 25 and verse 21. Are you in a situation this evening
where you can confidently know that the Lord approves of you and your lifestyle. Brother or sister, if you're not, if you need to come home and need prayers of the congregation, we're here for you. If you're here tonight and you're not yet a Christian, you're not yet a child of God, won't you make the decision to become one? Maybe you've been misguided. Maybe you've sought the approval of men, but you now recognize you want the approval of God. Come on and accept it now by being baptized into Christ based upon the belief and confession in Him. If you have any spiritual need, won't you please come forward as all together we stand and sing.